go. It's 10:30. The topic next is securing modern industrial infrastructure. Where does the buck actually stop? By Ms. Gretchen Myers. She is an innovations and solutions lead for cyber physical security at Accenture, focused on embedding security by design for industrial infrastructure. She has 30 plus years of experience leading global IT and security programs. She's a former IT distinguished engineer at Chevron, where she rebuilt security architecture and served as the first cloud security architect. Number one? All right. Yeah. Recognized thought leader in large-scale enterprise security transformation and program development. Without further ado,
all right. Thank you. Oh, look at you hopping down. So thank you for coming. I'll start with a little personal anecdote. I've just had 3 different people come in from my past life, 2 of which worked at Chevron and said, I saw your name and I'm so excited to see you here. I'm going next door to the quantum thing, but I'll catch up with you later. So I want to really thank all of you for choosing me today, because I think this is an interesting topic. It's one that tends to be discussed in hushed tones, because today I'm not really going to talk about the technology side, but how do we make decisions? How do we navigate office politics? And what does that mean for the state of our cybersecurity posture in our cyber-physical systems? So hopefully that will be of interest, and I will tell you some interesting stories. So if we can click to the next slide, perfect. So probably the most significant transformation that's happened in the last 10 years that has become real in the last 5 is IT-OT convergence is a thing. It has happened. If you are in the midst of a SASE deployment, you've probably already converged some of your network endpoints. And so what I wanted to talk about today is how this cloud infrastructure is changing the nature of how we make decisions in our OT environments. Historically, we've been able to use the Purdue model as a clear set of boundaries. You get the top and above, all of the IT networks, every IP network. I take care of everything below level 3, layer 3, my DCS systems, my SCADA environments, my PLCs. All of those pieces are the sphere. But then there was this little weird gray space that is the DMZ, and for years that was boundaried by 2 physical firewalls. Now with software-defined working, with software-defined infrastructure, we're starting to see that that boundary on the DMZ is collapsing, and we're seeing flatter implementations of Purdue that are no longer stratified through hardware, but are actually simplified through a software approach. And that creates an even blurrier boundary on how do we make decisions. Is it the plant operator, the GM of operations, or is it the CISO? Along with this convergence is the fact that CISOs more and more are taking accountability for OT security. So suddenly they're thrust from this IT security standardized approach. We have as many IT security standards as I have fingers on my hands. They all pretty much say the same things. Take care of the basics, protect your environment, monitor and detect and respond to incidents. But all of that perspective is through the lens of data protection and data breaches. It has less to do, until recently with ransomware attacks, with actual shutdown of operations. That mismatch of those IT security standards coming into the OT environment has led to a couple of decades of challenging conversations and people talking past each other. So I wanted to talk to you about today is some case studies of how that has gone sideways and what are steps that those organizations took, and then what you can do to actually start changing the nature of the dynamic. And perhaps some of you are already doing these activities, so if that's the case, I'd love to hear any questions or any feedback on how things are going in your particular situation. So feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. So if we could jump to the next slide. So where are people getting stuck? So I think the one we're most familiar with on the security side is always no. This is what security is branded with. We're always saying no. We say you can't do that. Although with OT security, often it is the OT system admins or your operators who are saying always no. And they're saying, you're not going to touch my environment. We've already secured it completely. That vulnerability you've identified has been completely protected by physical security and doesn't need to be addressed. The challenge with always know is you never really get to the root of the opportunity for the decision. So how do you think about what the issues are, what the trade-offs are, and how do you come to something that at least gives you a definable security posture with risk exposure tied to that? The second area is oblivious. This is another one that security gets branded with a lot, and this is the fact that OT security and OT networks are not IT networks. I was older than I care to admit and had more gray hair than I care to admit when I really understood the distinction between OT networks, or what we at Chevron called process control networks, and IT networks. I grew up being a network person. I had learned the OSI stack. I had all of those elements. What I never really understood is when you get down to the levels of systems and systems of systems, you're talking about a lot of different communication protocols that have zero to do with TCP/IP. And OT networks were actually the wrappers that we put around those distinct communication protocols to standardize those communications back to our IT systems. That difference is too easy to gloss over and misunderstand. So many of our IT professionals and our infrastructure security professionals come from an IP network world and assume that they understand everything about OT networks because it's just another IP-based network. It takes a while to get past those assumptions to really understand, how do I get past that? So that oblivious tag is to just say, just because it sounds like a network and it works like a network doesn't mean it's your standardized IP network. The next one, turf wars. I'm sure everyone in this room has gotten locked in a turf war of who actually owns, or in some cases, who doesn't own responsibility for taking action. So in this case, it looks a lot like field technicians and operators saying, you're not gonna, and I talked about that before with always know, you're not gonna touch my environment. Those are things that are part of the engineering stack, where cybersecurity, especially with CISOs taking on more accountability, and CISOs answer to the board. So they have the big stick of saying, I have to tell the board that this is a secure environment. And so it becomes this grappling of who is gonna decide. Also, it becomes a grappling of, oh, I don't have to worry about security in my facility because the CISO's got that covered. It's their accountability, it's their budget. I will do what I've always done and take care of my more pressing needs around operations, around safety risk, around environmental risk, and I will let the CISO worry about security. But I'm not necessarily going to understand what they want to do. I'm not necessarily going to make sure that I have the budget to actually plug in and deliver what they need. Flip side of that, CISOs, especially CISOs for whom this is a new responsibility, will start to say, oh, my plants tell me they're secure, they've got all the infrastructure covered, they've met all the marks, they've hit the SANS top 6, it's all great. But then they won't let me do any kind of an assessment. They won't let me look at a pen test because that could disrupt operations. And they won't really give me any visibility into that. But I'm going to trust that they've got this because they've been managing these environments for decades. So surely they have evolved their security stack as we have evolved technology. And then lastly, old school, which I just alluded to. A lot of blockers, and I felt this firsthand during our cloud transformation work at Chevron. A lot of the blockers come from legacy technology and legacy security approaches. And by that I mean, there has historically been the security approach of, if I put a firewall in front of it, then I can at least control the traffic. Well, firewalls in front of cloud APIs become unnecessary steps and stage gates. So as we have evolved into more software-defined environments, we've had to rely, and we've been saying, if you've been in security longer than a minute, you know we've been saying identity is the new perimeter for about 2 decades. Well, now we're really there, but it's not just identity. It's certs and API boundaries, and it's data and understanding, and this explosion of AI shiny objects is really shining a light on. We haven't really thought how we apply the security of API security, data security, and identity and access management all the way down into my data sources in OT. So when we think about old school, it is about how am I navigating legacy Purdue firewall stacks, DMZs, and other elements to actually extract the meaningful data with context that I want to power my AI models. So these are the kind of 4 different categories of how decisions get stalled and a little bit about why they get stalled. So we're going to talk through some case studies about how do these things manifest. So if we can jump to the next slide. So the first one, and this is a combination of turf wars and that first one that I just left my brain. It's been a minute since I've been on stage by myself, so give me a little grace. Essentially, but fragmented decision-making boils down to 2 different leaders or 2 different managers are not aligned, but they both have accountability for some component of the system under question. So in the first situation, we had the initial issue I was talking about, which was nobody was clear on who owned OT security. So in this situation, this was a global chemical company, and there were vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed. And nobody could decide whose budget needed to fund the work to patch those vulnerabilities. So they kept passing the ball back and forth. There were delays, there was analysis, there was negotiation. Actually, there wasn't negotiation. It was mostly just passing things back and forth. And it just got mired in the mud. Eventually, they realized that there was no conversation happening. Months had gone by, and nobody had made a decision about when to shut down the plant, when to apply the patch, how to evaluate whether that patch would impact operations, all of those details. So they had to put together some kind of a functional, cross-functional team to figure out those elements. Usually those types of conversations are happening between your line operators and your sysadmins, but it's hard to translate a deeply technical discussion back up the chain to a decision maker at the managerial level. So they created this forum in order to address that particular disconnect. And in that forum, they not only defined what are those clear escalation criteria, how do I actually say I need somebody higher than me to make a decision, but they also spent some time saying, if you are going to escalate this issue, this is the information I need. What is my risk exposure? What is the technology in question? What are the business processes or business lines that are in question? Is this in a complex facility like a refinery or an LNG plant? You will find my examples are often in resources. Or is it something more simple like a well pad or a pipeline terminal? Those environments and that context is really important to which experts you bring into the room and what those potential outcomes might be. The second decision is actually a little more unnerving because this one, if I can find my notes, this one was more focused on a known vulnerability that was a high-risk vulnerability. And it was the same situation where the IT leads and the OT leads, all the way up to those senior executives, could not agree on what window, because this was now time sensitive. It was an issue that needed to be resolved in a matter of days, and it was delayed for several weeks. At the end of the day, this organization ended up escalating this issue all the way to the CEO. And so I don't know how many of you have worked with CEOs, but I can tell you that 9 out of 10 CEOs I've worked with have zero understanding of complex technical environments. It's not that they don't have technical acumen. It's that they probably didn't grow up in a world where they were configuring routers and firewalls. And so when you start to talk about those levels of changes, of applying a patch to a particular server, of applying a particular configuration that is buried deep in processes or in systems, their eyes will glaze over, and they're going to ask the same question over and over again. What is the actual risk? When you escalate to the CEO, if you're not talking about value at risk or impact to operations, you are likely to just not get an effective decision. So this particular CEO, because he didn't feel he had the depth of knowledge and wasn't getting the context he needed to be comfortable making the decision, delayed that decision another 3 weeks while he collected information from his executives. This is a common challenge. Doesn't always get to the CEO, depends on the size of your company, but it does get to a senior executive who doesn't have that level of technical knowledge and often doesn't have the context. So again, this was a situation of how do we define that escalation criteria? How do we define those responsibilities? At which level can this decision be made? And then ultimately, how do I package a decision for somebody who is removed from the day-to-day in a way that they feel like they've got the context they need to make that decision? So these are two real-world examples. One was a global chemicals company. The second one, looking at my notes, I didn't write down which one it was. So I think it's the same global chemical company, actually. So these are just challenges that we've seen. And for the record, some of these examples I was personally involved with, some of them I extracted, and so I will not talk to details about any of them outside of the scenario itself. So with fragmented decision ownership, the root cause of this is, quite frankly, old organizational structures have not evolved with modern industrial infrastructure. So when we think about IT-OT convergence, historically, we've talked about air gapping, we've relied on separation of networks, we've relied on very clear-cut boundaries. And organizationally, that suited the siloed structure because operators and plant managers and facilities managers owned that OT space, and IT leaders and CISOs owned the enterprise network space. With SASE, with convergence, that line is completely blurred. And now those decisions get stalemated at that boundary point because it's unclear who gets to make the call. So if we go to the next slide, talked about this in some of the scenarios, some of the key things to address, next slide please, thank you, is first, and the most important, is to establish decision authority. Now what I mean by decision authority is literally, where does the buck stop? But it's not just where does the buck stop. Every decision doesn't have to be going all the way to the executive sponsor of an organization. If any of you have worked in more agile environments, you know that a lot of what is happening in software development now is decision-making is pushed to the person with the most context, or the individual. So product managers, product owners have a lot of leeway within certain constraints. So establishing decision authority is really defining what is that sphere of decisions that a line manager should be able to make on their own, and what are the criteria for that line manager to escalate a decision up the chain? It's not always, I can't agree with my counterpart. It's usually, this decision has an impact outside of my smaller sphere. So we spend some time working on that. I've talked about defining escalation criteria. What does that look like really? Often escalation criteria, and I have personally lived this in many different organizations, boils down to, I disagree. I disagree with my peer, we are deadlocked, and so we escalate it up the chain. And that is the only criteria. It is not, what is the impact of this decision? It is not, what is the value at risk of this decision? It is not, and so that first one was really that ecosystem systemic impact. It is not what organizations or what stakeholders may be affected by this decision. So establishing that escalation criteria is really getting down to the nitty-gritty of talking about your organizational structure and thinking about blast radius, thinking about value at risk, and then shaping that, much like we do with business impact analysis, to say, if it's within these boundaries, then line managers should have sufficient information to make those decisions. If not, or if one of those boundary conditions can't be met, then this is how you escalate. And the next thing is, This is how you standardize that executive briefing or the manager briefing. If you're talking about an operator and a technician who are disagreeing, they have to brief their supervisor. That needs to be a standard structure, and that standard structure allows you to make sure you've answered all the key questions. Which production line is involved? Is it a test production line? Is it a critical product line? Is this an environment that is actually a supporting system or a services environment that is less impactful? Understanding how to answer those questions in a meaningful way. And for the record, standardizing executive briefings is not a 40-page Word document that tries to answer every question. It is taking the escalation criteria and giving enough guidance to show how to answer those questions or prepare to answer those questions for the briefing. And if something comes up in the briefing, understanding how you follow up and provide that information. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about how to get into what this can actually look like at the end of the talk. But this is one way you get through this analysis paralysis. So if we can go to the next slide, I want to talk about the second common blocker, which is really the security architecture misalignment challenge. And this is where we get into legacy technologies and also highly over-engineered security approaches. Now, I have spent a lot of time working with clients since I've been with Accenture, but also deep in the weeds at Chevron and other companies, talking through what is actually necessary from a security architecture perspective. And the winds are shifting. For the entire time we have IT in the world, all of our standards, and if you read any standard, anywhere from 65 to 80% of it will be defined on protect your assets. Figure out what your assets are, figure out what the risk is associated with those assets, put in anywhere from 100 to 400 controls, and then cross your fingers. Over the last 20 years, cybersecurity, security operations has evolved, and now we're seeing the page turn to be, say, first comes observability. If I can see what's happening in the environment, I don't necessarily need to have all 400 controls in place. 400 controls is a compliance auditor's dream, because that means they have lots of boxes to tick, lots of evidence to look for, and lots of ways to say, gotcha, without really evaluating whether or not you were at risk. I would encourage all of you to go read the debriefs on pretty much any cyber incident, and then go look at that company and see what their history of regulatory failed audits is. I guarantee you most of them have passed their SOX audits, their regulatory audits, anything where an auditor is coming in and looking at their controls, but they still had a breach of some sort. That is the challenge that we have with a protect first mindset. So security misalignment is really starting to look at, we've pretty much gotten a lot of technology in place now that gives us a lot of observability, and more importantly, the ability to analyze that data in our IT and IP networks. But those boundaries, those nice air gaps, meaning that all that log information that is so brilliantly collected at lower levels doesn't come through with the context. And if we still have that standard Purdue firewall infrastructure in place, it's highly likely that those data flows are not coming into a place where you get full situational awareness. So that is the challenge with security misalignment. So all right. So how does this manifest in a challenge in an OT environment? Well, the first one that I've just alluded to is a lack of visibility for your security operations teams. The second one, and this ties to that oblivious blocker, is oftentimes network designs and refreshed security architectures do not always understand the communication protocols of the networks they're connecting to, or more accurately, trying to protect. So in this instance, this particular case was a rollout to plants of a new SASE implementation that hadn't taken into account certain communication protocols that were required for plant operators to manage their environments. And so they shut down at least one facility. And I don't actually have it in my notes, sorry about that. And so the challenge became operators were insisting on opening the ports they needed to access their HMIs and their systems, whereas security insisted that those had to be locked down because it was a security risk to have them open. When we talk about security architecture misalignment, this is getting to the root of the problem, because you're talking about technology where I'm using the same words. I'm talking networks, I'm talking ports, I'm talking firewalls sometimes, not always, but I'm talking about them in very different contexts. Thinking about an industrial firewall sitting at level 2 that is protecting my HMI or separating my HMI, and it might not even be a firewall, it's probably just a router or even a switch. Thinking about that in the context of a broader SASE deployment, it's so easy to talk past each other. So when we talk about security misalignment, it is also the fact that we're using the same words, the same things to communicate with each other. And I've seen this multiple times, and a few in this room who have worked with me have heard me tell these stories about sitting in rooms where everyone walked out of the room believing they had come to agreement and didn't realize until many months later, many weeks later, that they had fundamentally disagreed, but because they were using the same words about somebody has to define their risk exposure, we have to deploy a new security architecture, we have to think about this from a systems perspective. All of those words were common, but in very different context. So as security practitioners and security leaders, that is one of the most fundamental challenges we face is, have we framed every conversation and every decision in a way so that we know people have that context in place? So if we can jump to the next slide. So this is where I say review board, mostly because I have started to hate using the word committee. I think when you start talking committees, especially in corporate environments, there is a committee for everything. You don't need a committee for every decision. But you do need to have a way to bring knowledgeable, technical SMEs, and this is not necessarily your line leaders. This is not managers and budget jockeys. This is somebody who is a deep expert in the technology that is being discussed. And they need to have a way to come together and have a fight and listen to each other and come to resolution. So I talk a lot about architecture review boards. Recently, I was working with a midstream and downstream company where they went through and completely revamped. They actually had an IT architecture board that was 95% talking about change management to SAP and almost none on any infrastructure decision, whether it was the IT networks, the servers, or going into their plant facilities. So they brought together an infrastructure review board, and again, I've got a slide that'll show how these things work together in order to bring those technical experts into the room, their IT systems leads, their security architects, more importantly, their network architects who understood that enterprise perspective so that they could talk through to their heart's content, to every granular technical specification, what did this change really mean? So that is one of the largest gaps I've seen, not just from a networking perspective, but with cloud, now we have to do that from a platform and a capabilities perspective. If you've been working on cloud transformations, you know now, and I'll pick on AWS, AWS I think now has over 250 capabilities that you can serve up to anybody who wants to work with them. And a lot of those capabilities can enable your IoT environments, your warehousing facilities, getting into touching that OT side. So how are you navigating the governance of those capabilities? So this need for this joint tailored review from an architecture perspective is only going to grow more complicated. All right, so last issue. Most of what I've talked about so far has been very focused on the protect side, the governance side. But if we can go to the next slide. Probably the seminal issue is who's in charge with crisis response. So I have had the fortune in the last few years of getting to work on some very large breach responses. and learning a lot more and refreshing myself of what incident response looks like from the inside out. And what I can tell you is the hardest thing is some of the hard business-facing decisions that have been made. So I'm going to ask for a show of hands before I talk about this any further. How many of you have had a tabletop for any kind of incident response, whether it was business continuity or cybersecurity, in the last 12 months? So, decent. Now, how many of you had an executive, and by executive, I mean a C-level executive, 2 of them participate in that tabletop? All right, awesome. That's some good news. But you saw there was a couple of hands in the room. What happens with ransomware is all of a sudden executives are in the middle of a cyber incident response where the clock is ticking, making probably the most significant business decision of their career. And they're not prepared because they assume cyber is the CISO's problem. OT is my ops problem. Those guys have got it covered. They're not prepared for a multi-million-dollar ransomware decision. Now, that's changing because we do have a few hands that came up. More and more CEOs and C-level executives are starting to recognize they want to understand who's affected by that decision and who needs to have a say. But that still hasn't translated to them making the time to actually understand how to practice for preparing or prepare for making that decision. They assume they'll be able to do it on the fly in the moment. And we know that's probably the worst thing possible. So, and probably the most publicly known issue that illustrates that is the Colonial Pipeline breach. And the CEO has gone on record saying that it was one of the hardest decisions he ever made to pay that ransom. He was not prepared for having to navigate those conversations, but he was also very fortunate that they were able to recover some of the ransom that was paid. The Justice Department was able to trace that down. Not everyone is going to be so lucky to get about 50% of that payment back. And in fact, one of the breaches I worked on last year, I think that they are continuing to be hit with demands because it was very sensitive data that was compromised, and they still haven't recovered it to the point where they're comfortable making sure that they've dealt with all of that. So let's shift gears and talk about how do we make these changes. So if we can jump to the next slide. So the first is understanding what are the roles that people play organizationally. I like to think of people, and as a thinker, you'll notice I say thinker, leaders who are your executives, your CIO, your CISO, your VP of operations, your chief of, your COO, the executive tier. Leaders really care about money and outcomes. So their focus is very much on the strategic flow. And if they are involved in a security conversation, it is through one of 2 lenses. What is the CISO's budget? What are we going to give him and the CIO to drive digital transformation? And the second is the O moment of we have a problem. The thinker level is really where you've heard about the frozen middle. This is where a lot of things get stuck, especially in challenging cultures. Again, I'm sure we've all experienced a culture where the reason we escalate decisions is not because we aren't comfortable making them, because we know if we don't get the boss involved, then they won't cover our proverbial you-know-what. So those thinkers and those managers are the ones that are sitting in that middle level, understanding the trade-offs. And I'm going to tell a story on one of my former employees from Chevron about his changing from doer to thinker. At the time, we were working on building a new platform to collect data from our OT environments. It was part of our IoT infrastructure. We were trying to collect emissions data. And I asked this particular individual to sub in for a meeting for me because I was unavailable, I had a conflict. And at that time, I was the lead for this platform. So I was right in the middle of that square thinker level, director level type of role where I'm overseeing multiple teams, and I just asked him to go represent me into this cross-functional meeting. He came back from that meeting going, oh my God, all they did was complain and complain and complain. Nobody wanted to make a decision. Nobody had any information that they needed. It was so frustrating because this guy was a get-it-done guy. And at the time, I was like, yeah, that's how those meetings tend to run. What I wish I had told him in that moment is, that's the job. Because he and I had been talking about what does the next level look like. I didn't take that learning moment to say, that's the job of a thinker. You've got to sit in that meeting, listening to 40 different points of view from 10 people, and figure out how you're going to influence them to come to alignment. When you sit in that frozen middle, which many of us do, you have to navigate influence as your primary currency. And so that's the job of the thinker. And that's why they're the thinkers to me, because it's not just about I'm sitting in a room coming up with the most wonderful security design. It's I'm thinking about who are all the players, what are all the trade-offs, what is the impact? I'm thinking about a lot of different aspects of what could happen in my industrial environment. And then the lowest tier, and I shouldn't call them the lowest tier because they're really the most important tier, it's your frontline doers. These are the people who are making changes. And so they, of all of the groups on this slide, have the most context about what is happening on the ground. And so the thinker's job, in a lot of ways, is to understand the doer's life, take that information and translate it for others. But the doers are the ones who are actually going to push the button, drive that configuration, navigate the environment. And so they're also very critical in every single one of these decisions. So first step is just spending some time looking at yourself and your organization and saying, where are my leaders? Leaders are not always labeled by a title. Leaders are decision makers. Where are my thinkers? Thinkers are your connectors, they're your managers, they're day-to-day work guidance, and doers, probably the easiest to identify, actually out there getting stuff done. When we've got that, let's go to the next slide, please. Then we can start thinking about how do I build a model? Now, this is the model that I worked on with the client that I had earlier this year, the midstream downstream company. And what we realized is we needed to have a way for our thinkers, which are the two middle tiers, and our, well, actually, it's three of those tiers. The doers are the ops council more so. And how do we actually provide some guidance? So there's a lot of words on this slide. I believe these will get shared. I'll make sure. But fundamentally, what this boils down to is that top box represents the thing we all usually have, some kind of a decision review board or a steering committee of executives who say, I will give you this much money to achieve these objectives. We've aligned on these are the core objectives. In this particular instance, it was the VP of operations and the CISO, the CIO, working together to say this is how we're going to fund the digital initiatives required in our refineries. On the far left, you see the Risk and Controls Council. Now, this is not the security architecture side. That's not where it lived. This is actually the group that came up with the universe of controls that mattered, and how do I apply those controls? What's the guidance for when I care about those controls? So this is a typical risk and controls governance group. It was predominantly the security team that did this, but they would pull in stakeholders from other groups as needed. The bottom box is the one that was the big gap, where we defined the charter for what ultimately became the Infrastructure Review Board. It started out being the OT Security Review Board because there was a lot of concern. The whole project was around IT-OT convergence. But as I mentioned earlier, what we learned that their regular Architecture Review Board was completely focused on SAP and the application tier. And they really didn't have anything that was looking at any of their systems outside of that app tier. So the Infrastructure Review Board became your network architecture. Any network change had to go through this board. Any change that affected OT architectures, so changing that edge technology stack, And in this environment, this was a company that had grown through acquisition, so they did not have common networking edge stacks across all of their refineries. So they didn't have common ways to collect logging information into a unified SIM. So this review board became the critical piece of how they revamped their governance. But the second critical piece is the one that is closest to me, the Operations Council. And this became the other really important body that had already grown up organically, but we were able to formalize it. And this was representatives from all the refineries and the pipeline organizations to say, we understand the priority of all of the security and infrastructure changes that are being requested by the enterprise, but we have to figure out how to fit that into the flow of normal operations. If I'm a refinery, a lot of those changes may happen in a turnaround that's coming up in 6 months, and now I can include those in that work plan. If I'm a pipeline, I have to tie it to a terminal upgrade or some other operational event. So the Operations Council became the broker for the roadmap of how do we work towards these objectives. So you had two key things that got added in, because you had security and risk covered already, and you had the executives who were saying, go get stuff done. What you didn't have was a way to say, we've evaluated the decision to understand the impacts, and we agree and are aligned this is the best path forward. And you didn't have a way to say, this is how we're going to stage gate it through all of our facilities, tied to facilities roadmaps, and with the buy-in from those plant managers and other facilities managers, so that they're aligned and will champion the change at the time it needs to be applied. And it also made it easier for auditors to go, oh, you're not going to go hit the refinery, and I'm going to say Pascagoula, but that's not the company I'm talking about, in Pascagoula for another 12 months. But that's because that's when the turnaround is scheduled. And I see here that you have these other mitigating controls in place before you do this upgrade. Auditors love that kind of information. They rarely get it. So this is one way to think about a governance model. So let's go to the next slide. And I talked about those bottom three. So what's next? What can you do in the room today? First thing, who's making decisions in your organization? Is it the actual leaders? Or is it other influencers that have more knowledge and are trusted advisors? I recently was on LinkedIn and saw a colleague who now is based in Ireland, and he posted in an article about what he had learned over his many decades career. And he said, influence is actually more powerful than authority. And I thought about it for a few minutes, and I realized he is 100% correct. When you have influence, when you have done the work to understand where decisions are being made and how to influence those decision makers, you have a much broader scope of how you can impact your organization. First step to that, understand who's making the decisions. The second one, and this is one we talk about a lot in security, but gets stale really fast, and that is collect those documents, understand your reference architectures, take the time to build a repository that is specific to security architecture. When you start to make changes, that becomes your common language. That repository is how you build common dialogue and common context. The last thing, create opportunities for cross-functional dialogue. Go out, if you haven't ever gone and been to a facility where you needed to have safety glasses, earplugs, and steel toes, but you work in an industrial company, go. Just go. If you need to get somebody to sign off on it, find a way. But going and understanding that environment and talking to the people who are in those environments will immensely broaden your understanding of what it is you're trying to secure. If you're in a facility, if you spend your entire day wearing PPE, take the time to join some of the IT town halls. Take the time to get to know who are the people asking you to do things so that you can understand the context they're coming from. It's too easy when we're close to the revenue to say, oh, corporate. I actually was many decades ago doing a business impact analysis and literally had one of the field technicians say, you know what, you could blow up corporate headquarters and we would keep producing oil because we don't need them. However, you do need them. You need them for two reasons. You need them for funding, And you need them for air cover if something bad goes down, because that's where your attorneys sit, that's where all of those other functions sit. So there's still a relationship there. So take the time to understand what's happening on any side of a conversation. So those are 3 concrete actions I hope you can take out with you. I think I'm right at time, but I'm happy to take questions up here at the front of the room while they get it prepped for the next speaker. So thank you everyone for listening to me. I really appreciate your time today.